appears as though something has happened in the motorcade route. Something, I repeat, has happened in the motorcade route.
The President of the United States is dead.
Considering the number of enemies that he had, Lord knows they had reasons to get rid of him.
And I know that her face is down like this. She pushed him down and crawled out of the back to get a piece of skull off the back of the car.
Turned out that he left his tape recorder going when he left the room.
That bullet then traversed and moved backward. And then you do have the shot from the rear that struck him in the back, and I think there was another shot that hit him in the back of the head.
It didn't make any sense why one guy who suddenly went from having fired a rifle since the Marine Corps and suddenly was able to pull off world-class precision.
Was there a real thread of that fear running through the administration that perhaps a coup could take place?
He and Kenny O'Donnell were told they had to change their stories for the good of the country. He had to basically lie about what he saw.
Showtime! Welcome to the show. Welcome back, Larry. Larry Hancock's joining us tonight. Folks, let me bring up this, a little bit about his bio. Get the coffee going, get the tea going, or get a beverage of choice going. Sit back in your most comfy chair. Take this time for yourself. Larry Hancock, investigative writer. Larry brings his formal training in history and cultural anthropology to his research and writing on Cold War history and national security subjects. He's a graduate of the University of New Mexico. He earned his BA with honors, no less. Larry served in the United States Air Force, and I've got my poppy on. Remembrance Day is coming up here in Canada, November 11th, which is Veterans Day.
Yeah.
In the States. Is that correct? Yeah. Okay.
That's correct. Yep.
Thank you for your service. He is a prolific writer and has written such titles as Someone Would Have Talked, which I read like the Bible long before, 10 years before I ever got into the JFK assassination. I was still in Montreal at the time. Killing King, amazing book. The Awful Grace of God with Stuart Wexler. The Bible, again, the Bible on the killing of Dr. Martin Luther King. And Larry will be appearing at the JFK Lancer 2024 conference virtually, as I will be, and I'll be prepared to answer questions, and so will Larry about his presentation of his work. Tonight, we're going to talk about something that is dear to my heart, and that is the Cuban Missile Crisis and the possibilities that there was a coup in place to take over the administration, the U.S. administration, and perhaps a coup in its own mirror reflection to take over the presidium in the Soviet Union. So I'm going to start off October 16th, 1962. It's a Tuesday, and it begins. Larry, were you alive during those times? I mean, I know you were alive, but were you cognizant of what was going on?
Oh, yes, very cognizant. We happen to live near one of the earliest US ICBM bases. We were a primary target. I remember listening to the news reports of the U-2 being shot down over Cuba, and we anticipated we would be at war within 24 hours. And we totally realized that we were a primary atomic missile target. So we very much considered ourselves as part of what was going on. Absolutely.
Now, you weren't in the forces at the time, right? You weren't in the Air Force. Okay. You were teenager, young teenager?
A teenager, right.
Okay.
Junior high, probably. Yeah, at that point in time.
Just to give the folks that weren't around in that time a little bit of what you were fearing, can you tell us a little bit about what your family was doing to prepare for the inevitability that there would be a nuclear strike near your home?
In all honesty, we were not doing anything. We live very remotely. We live in a very rural area. I think my parents probably bought some extra, food and that sort of thing, but we had our own water. We had our own well. We did have, the ability to grow our own food, gardens, chickens, that sort of thing. So that really wasn't the primary concern. And at the time, I don't really think my folks understood the impact of the radiation that we would have picked up, because if those missile bases had been struck, we would have been downwind, and probably, in all honesty, probably there wouldn't have been much. We did have a shelter, a tornado shelter that would have served fairly well for some period of time from radiation protection, but they really didn't talk that much about it. If they were doing any special preparation, I didn't hear it. I was listening to the news reports myself, and to some extent might have been more concerned about the radiation effects than they were. I was pretty much turned into military history even as a teenager at that time. So I may have been more concerned about that aspect than they were. To tell the truth, at that point in time, I am not even sure that they were as well aware of that ICBM base also housed a major SAC atomic bomber base. And they knew that, but I'm not sure that they really thought through the implications.
Well, it wasn't long well, it was about 15, 17 years after World War II. And I know, reading some Churchill books, he just figured the nuclear bombs were just bigger bombs. He didn't realize or wasn't really cognizant of the fact that it's the fallout that is the real danger through all this and the aftermath thereof. And that's what will do a lot of the killing afterwards. Moving forward, did you watch the president's address? This was October 16th that they first found out about it. He did an address to the public. Was it October 19th or 20th?
Yes, I do remember the president's address. Yes, watching it on television.
One of the things he said, which terrifies me when I was doing my research, is that he was prepared to launch a full, and I'm going to quote, retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union. He was prepared to do that. He said that right outright. He had called the Soviet ambassador a liar, essentially. He said a lot of the statements that were made to him were false in this speech. How did you react to that speech when he said it, Larry?
In all honesty, during the height of the Cold War, that was the standing assumption. The standing assumption was always that the U.S. would not strike first, but if we were hit with atomic weapons, that it would be a full retaliatory strike. And certainly we know from the research, I spent a lot of time with this in a book I wrote called Surprise Attack. So we now know that our strategic response plan, there was no subset. It was all or none. One of the things that Kennedy learned from the missile crisis was that it was all or not. The PSYOP, the strategic plan for launching against the Soviets, didn't involve just the Soviets. It would involve the Chinese, basically every Eastern European country. There was no subset. And actually, one of the consequences was that JFK ordered the creation of a set of responses. He was appalled by the fact that when he did begin asking this question, it's like, I just said that we would do this. By the way, let's review again what that involves. Oh, wait a minute. I have no options. If I give the order, it's all or none. I do think, though, that from the talk at the time, I think the perception was very much that we would probably attack Cuba. I don't think that there was a general perception that the Soviet Union would take that as an attack and strike us. I really feel at that point in time, we were confident enough in our superiority that we felt that the general public felt that we could go to war in Cuba, and that would not necessarily lead to a Soviet nuclear attack.
So that was the feeling in the media. That was the feeling amongst the country. Now,
and I think that's one of the reasons why my parents the thought was, we'll be going to war in Cuba. you
It was
know,
survivable in the same sense
and
that,
that's survivable. We'll face the Russians in Cuba and whatever, and we'll win. What we didn't know, Brent, and absolutely did not know at the time, that the Russians had tactical nuclear weapons in Cuba. And I think that would have made the big difference. That level of complexity we did not know. We pretty much viewed it, I think, as a matter of bombing and airstrikes. And then after that was done, I don't think there was any doubt that we would take over the island. I think, if anything, it was thought of more as a military intervention, just on a larger scale, that we had been carrying out against communist governments in Latin America. Here's another communist government. They've invited the Russians in. The Russians have even gone further. Now we have to respond, because if who knows where's the next set of missiles going to be? Is it going to be in Nicaragua? Is it going to be in Venezuela? It was an escalation of communist advance in Latin America, and Cuba would be like, okay, this is the last straw.
we got to remember, folks, to put it in the context of the time. They had just fought a similar war in the Second World War, where they saw Hitler taking over country after country, marching in, making promises, false promises. Oh, no, they're just, they want us in there. They want us in the Sudetenland. They want us in Austria. And country after country would fall. So these were the same generals that fought that war, that were primarily on the chiefs of staffs. And that's where I want to go. You had mentioned General LeMay, who was he the SAC commandant at that time? No, he was Air Force, I think, at that time, if I'm not mistaken.
He was Air Force at that time. Then Kennedy actually moved him, interestingly enough, promoted him from Chief of Staff Air Force to Joint Chiefs.
Any speculation on why he would do that? Because, I talked with Ted Sorensen, JFK speechwriter, and he was the guy that wrote the letter to Khrushchev to get him back down, essentially, just to give you some context. And he was on the XCOM meetings. He was not fond of General LeMay. He said he was the most detestable person he'd ever met.
We have a quote from Kennedy himself, because he was asked that after the Cuban Missile Crisis. We know this guy doesn't like you. We know this guy doesn't think you act strongly enough. Why would you promote him, essentially? And Kennedy's response was, look, I don't ever want to fight a nuclear war. But if I have to fight a nuclear war, I want an SOB in charge who will win it.
Wow.
Yeah. And LeMay had that kind of reputation. You've got to remember, LeMay had a reputation of actually turning around strategic bombing in Europe by telling basically his air command that they were paying too much attention to German air defense. And they're going to have to ignore the flak. They're going to have to ignore it. And then he led the missions. Yeah, Kennedy knew how bad he was, but Kennedy also knew that he could not afford to lose. If he was forced into nuclear war, you want the baddest badass you got leading the charge. So. We all got to remember, Kennedy was like the ultimate pragmatist. He would do things that he didn't like if he thought they were absolutely necessary.
I asked Ted if he thought there was a chance that the military could take over Kennedy. And then he told me a couple of stories, of course, that kind of sent chills up and down my spine. One of them, of course, was when they were sending Bobby Kennedy to Dobrynin with the letter. Bobby Kennedy was told two things orally, and that was, first, they've got to get it done and get it done quickly, because right now the administration's in charge, but the Hawks, they called them the Hawks in those days, could rise up at any time, and they were concerned about that. And the other thing they told them, that this couldn't happen right away, that they would have to take some time to go over it. They couldn't just shut it down. How do you feel about the chance of a coup taking place in the United States during that time?
I honestly don't think, it's kind of, if you look at the book 7 Days in May, which presents a coup project, it's not a coup of the Joint Chiefs. Interestingly enough, it's a coup of a particular Joint Chief, who has political aspirations. Interestingly enough, there's no sign that LeMay ever, until he decided he'd run with, later on, but he didn't see himself in Mole. He saw himself as a military leader. And even so, when he agreed to run as vice president, it was as vice president, you know. I think what the real risk that's painted in 7 Days in May is that you have a Joint Chiefs level type military officer who's willing to bring in commanders down further in the chain, not other chiefs, but like say Sync Atlantic, Commander in Chief Atlantic, Mediterranean, Pacific, the guys who really control the forces. Because you've got to remember, the Joint Chiefs really did not control the forces. They were not an operational command. They could raise defense conditions or something like that, but literally orders to the military forces did not come from the Joint Chiefs. They came from the commanders, the strategic commanders. So I think in that book, you see this fellow reaching out and touching two or three of the commanders and basically getting their agreement that, you know, if we manage to essentially take over communications, neutralize the president, will you support us? And getting some sort of head nod, you know. I think that was more the model than any, say, coup by the Joint Chiefs. I think from what I've seen and what Robert was really concerned about and JFK were really concerned about were field commanders like Sync Atlantic doing something that provoked a real strategic response. That's why Robert and McNamara went down and sat with Sync Atlantic and said, you tell us what you're going to do if this happens, if they cross the line, this or that. And he told them, and they said, no, you're not. Nope. We're going to go straight. Right now, the president is saying, no, you can't do that. Okay. I think the scenarios I've seen that really result in a coup are those where Sync Atlantic most probably, or say the Special Operations Command was located in Florida, responded to something and essentially provoked a Russian missile strike. If the Russians had launched, and now we know that part of their protocol was actually if they felt that their missiles were under attack, then they had automatic direction to launch.
Yeah.
So if that had happened and they had launched and they had taken out Washington, D.C., and taken out JFK and the White House and the command structure, yeah, you would have had officially a military takeover. And I think that's a more likely scenario is a operational military chief essentially doing something kind of like as a knee-jerk reaction, like this is how we do things, and provoking an atomic strike. That I certainly can see happening. The Joint Chiefs, if you step back and look forward a year later at, for example, their response to Laos, the Joint Chiefs were not in agreement with each other. Newman has done a great job of documenting their dialogues and their meetings with JFK, and they weren't in agreement with each other. They did not have consensus in many aspects. One or two individuals might organize something that you would call a coup, but not the Joint Chiefs as a body.
Okay, a couple of things I've got to bring people up to speed on. 7 Days in May was a great book. Indeed, it was about a coup taking place in America, and I think it was written 1962, 63. Anyways, that's when the movie came out. And the movie is of the same title by John Frankenheimer. Terrific movie. I'd recommend anybody who's interested in the Cold War and give that a watch. Because as we know, in any democracy and, well, in any country, for that matter, whoever controls the military controls the country. The other thing I wanted to mention, you had mentioned Newman. It's John Newman. His book, which is here somewhere, I think, behind me, is called JFK in Vietnam, and it's a must-read, folks, for anybody that's interested in the information that JFK was being fed about Vietnam. Now, a funny little story, it was a great segue. Sorensen tells a funny little story about Admiral Anderson, who was the Joint Chiefs of Staff for the Navy, I believe. And this is the guy that McNamara went down and micromanaged, if you will. Robert McNamara, folks, was the Secretary of Defense for the United States during that period, and he did an amazing job. He helped end the crisis. Now, getting back to this Admiral Anderson, Anderson got so mad with McNamara that he went to see JFK himself and said, what I want to do is go out and meet the boats that are way out of our protective zone and stop them there. So before they get in the protective zone, in other words, escalating the situation that JFK wanted to de-escalate, because don't forget, we're talking about nuclear war here. This isn't just a little slap on the hand or anything. We're on the edge here. Anyways, as Ted said, his punchline was, and that's how ambassadors to Portugal are made.
And yes, indeed. And JFK was pretty direct about that. A couple of anecdotes. Anderson and Sink Atlantic, Commander-in-Chief Atlantic, actually during the Bay of Pigs, during the Cuba project and the Bay of Pigs, had some direct communications with the CIA officers who were running that project. And we now know that they had reached some agreements with CIA Officer Richard Bissell that JFK was not aware of. And I write about this in my book, In Denial. And one of the interesting things about that is JFK was not aware at all that the Navy chief and Sink Atlantic had deployed a strategic atomic carrier battle group off Guantanamo Bay. There's no sign that he was briefed on that. There's no sign that he was briefed on the fact that the Bay of Pigs command carrier Essex had ground attack aircraft on board, very possibly with atomic weapons. The point is, the military is always going to, it never, especially after Pearl Harbor, it never wants to be caught behind the curve. You know, if something happens, we want to be prepared to respond with extreme force. You know, we don't want to lose. We're going to win from the very beginning. The Navy people were given information from the CIA about what was going on, possibly in more detail, and then made their own preparations that JFK didn't know about. They would consider that good practice, best practices, the way we play the game. The interesting thing, what the Navy was not told, was that Mr. Bissell appears to have arranged for a fake attack on Guantanamo, which, as it turns out, did not occur. But if it had occurred, the Navy would have been setting right offshore, and if it base had been attacked, Cuba's gone. And JFK would have been going, what? Who? When? And he would have been behind the curve. And I think that's always what we're talking about here, is the president finding himself behind the curve in situations where the military is essentially in charge because combat started. And no president's going to back off after that. We do know that even then, during the missile crisis, JFK sent personal representatives to Florida to see exactly what was going on and the preparations, that the staging that was occurring. He was not necessarily sure of his channels of communications from the military. Are they doing more than I think they're doing? Kind of like going to visit the admiral. What are you really doing? You know, what is your plan? Because presidents don't have that level of knowledge. They rely on the military to do that. So, and sometimes the Joint Chiefs don't have that level of knowledge either. They may not know what the field commanders are doing in excess of caution.
Folks, I just want to mention that we're speaking with Larry Hancock tonight, extraordinary researcher. He's got all kinds of books out. We got to the point in the XCOM meeting when I was talking with Sorensen, and he said, okay, so what are we going to do? So somebody came up with the idea of, they called it a quarantine because, as to quote Ted, if we said blockade, that's an act of war. So we had to fudge with the language. Somebody had the idea for a blockade, and everybody else wanted to go in. And as Larry said, had they gone in, they had local authorization to launch tactical nuclear weapons on the troops that were landing on the beach. The other problem was, if they did go into Cuba, there was several thousand Russian soldiers there that were operating these machines and teaching the Cubans how to operate the nuclear weapons. They would have been killed as well. So all of a sudden, imagine if the United States was attacked in one of its bases overseas and a bunch of people were killed, a bunch of American citizens were killed. There's going to be a retaliation. And we haven't talked about
even more
Berlin.
than that, Brent, not just the missile sites. We now know that they had full armored battalions. They had deployed major ground forces in Cuba. And not just as far as the landing is concerned, we also know that within 15 miles of Guantanamo naval base, they had at least 5 ground-to-ground atomic weapons deployed. So again, in any attack, Guantanamo would have been gone. You would have lost thousands of military personnel and dependents, not just military personnel. Let's put it this way. The U.S. military was overconfident with the data that it had. You have 2 tracks. Obviously, you have a military track and a political track going on in both countries. And in Russia, we know that that military track would actually conclude Khrushchev's reign as the Russian leader within a relatively short period of time. He definitely bore the consequences. The people held a grudge. But the reason, and
Seems
interestingly
JFK
enough,
did too.
yeah, yes, that's right.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, the reason that they bore a grudge wasn't as much as the fact that he had backed down per se, as that he had done something at his own initiative that was highly risky. He did not have the full support of the Soviet leadership in this high risk game of putting those missiles into Cuba. And that was something he did pretty much entirely on his own. And of course, when that works, you're great. And when it doesn't work, everybody else goes, well, we would have told you not to do that. And the consequences occur, right? Obviously,
Yeah.
you can't make good decisions. We need to be making the decisions ourselves. The other aspect of his bad decision was that he definitely had not counted on Castro. He had not counted on how aggressive Castro was, how you'd almost have to say unbalanced, because now we
Yes,
know
I agree.
after the fact Castro was ready to go to war. Castro, the commands that shot down the U-2 that we talked about in the beginning, that almost precipitated something much worse, were the Cuban position, not the Russian position. And what we also know is now that the command and control networks were such that the Cubans were in the middle. The Cubans were in a position to take over anti-aircraft batteries, take over missile batteries, force people to do things, whereas the Russian commands out of Moscow were much harder to enforce just by the infrastructure on the island. Moscow did not have operational control. Castro did, which is why, interestingly enough, Khrushchev had not realized how upset Castro would become. It's like Khrushchev didn't really want a nuclear war. You know, Castro seems at the time to have been willing to do
Oh
whatever,
yeah.
which appears strange, knowing that he would lose. But I guess he was really fired up after the Bay of Pigs. You know, you win a big one like that, it's kind of like we can always take on the Yankees. But Castro himself turned desperately against the Soviets within the next 2 years. That's why, and literally neutered them politically inside Cuba, which led him to the point of 1963 of actually approaching JFK for a deal. Russians out, neutrality, again the embargo, so Khrushchev did not foresee that either. So on the Soviet side, Khrushchev made a lot of really bad decisions. On the American side, JFK made some really good decisions.
Larry, we're going to have to start to wrap up now, but I want to keep you around. We're going to do a part 2. The show has to be under 30 minutes now, but we're not going to get it all in 30 minutes. I was dreaming in Technicolor. So, folks, I'm going to sign off right now, but there will be a part 2 right after this. So, and I will put the link up and you'll be able to just click on that. So I'm Brent Holland from The Brent Holland Show. Thank you all for joining us. We'll see you next time.